I'm going to give you a little bit of information on the brakes of this machine, how it works. I'm not a professional at making videos, so I'm going to do what I can. This is our avocado orchard. Those are avocado trees. And those are lime trees. And this is our toy.
This is not a test.
We interrupt this message to bring you this important announcement. At the end of this video, I'm going to make a checklist that maybe you can take a screenshot of and print it out and have it with you when you're doing this job. I think it will be helpful. One more thing I want to tell you is to remove the yoke. I used a 1 3/4 socket, but it does not seem that that is the right size. It is whatever metric size is bigger than 1 3/4. But we are in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and it's about a 5-hour drive to go and come back to the nearest city where I would be able to find the right socket. I asked a local mechanic. He didn't have anything in that big, and then I went to a guy that welds and repairs tractors, and he lent me an 1 3/4, but that's all I could find. So I tapped it into the yoke nut with a sledgehammer, and it sounds bad, but it actually went in very easy. It was just barely tapping. The problem with that is once I reinstall that nut, getting the socket out of there was going to be impossible. So what I did was I ground down the nut to work with the 1 3/4 socket. Just wanted to let you know about that part. And about the part about the printout that you can print at the end of this, and I'm sure it will be helpful. And now, on with our show. This is the brake cap. This is the front of it when it's on the machine. The yoke goes in here, and then the drive shaft. And the hydraulic hose that comes from the transmission and brake system. When you need to tow the machine, you tighten these, and these release the pressure on the discs in here. It gets a bunch of discs. I'll show you in a minute. It pushes the pressure plate away from the discs to allow the yoke to move. When it's not getting hydraulic pressure, the springs push on this, so that's why the machine is off. When the machine is off, the brake is on. These discs are in here like that, and this part of the pressure plate, so this goes like this. When these pressure plates are squeezed, they can't turn, and there's not the yoke itself, but there's something in there that grabs onto these spikes and doesn't let the yoke turn. The springs push on here. When hydraulic pressure goes in here, it pushes this disc back this way against the springs, and this whole section out here is the one that gets full of the hydraulic oil. That hydraulic oil never goes into this area or into the rear axle. It is kept in there between this plate in here with this O-ring. There's an O-ring here. This O-ring seals here, and this outer O-ring seals here. So it becomes a compartment in there. You can call it a cylinder. It becomes a cylinder in here. With the hydraulic pressure, this gets pushed back against the springs, and it releases these discs to be able to turn freely and release the brake. Maybe that's too much of an explanation, but I tend to do that. When you remove this thing from the tractor, it's a good idea to loosen all the screws slowly and evenly. One turn here, one turn there, and so forth, to come out evenly, because the springs are pushing out on it. The springs are not very long. They're only pushing about 3/4 of an inch or an inch, something like that. I think it's more like 3/4. So just loosen all of these slowly so that it comes out evenly, so it doesn't push out on one end. If you remove these and then you remove these, then you're gonna have a lot of force pushing out on these, against these screws. Also, maybe I should have told you in the beginning, but hopefully you're not like me that starts doing the things before seeing the whole video. You need to drain the rear diff before taking off that brake cap. My brake seals were messed up, and all the hydraulic fluid from the transmission was leaking into the differential. So when I drained it, I got almost 2 full buckets of hydraulic fluid out of the differential. And then when you refill it, when you put it back in, it only gets 18 liters of hydraulic fluid in the differential or rear axle, whatever you want to call it. But you do need to drain it before removing this cap, or it will all spill out through there. Also, when you're gonna put this back together, the O-rings are a bit tight. I oiled them up. I put this thing on the floor. I put this cap on. I put a rag over it, and then I stepped on it, and it went in. But this does need to have a certain orientation. Mine has a little dingle thing here. Mine has that little nipple, and it goes aligned like this, with this to there. And also, you need to align all of these so that they are in line with each other's. So I'm gonna do that right now. When you're putting it back together, most of these are screws. 2 of them are studs. This stud came out with the nut, but this one stayed in place. It's probably best if both studs stay on there to help you align and keep this in place. Once you put it on there, it's not closed all the way, because this is how much the springs push it out. It's in by hand right now, and it's only about 5/8 of an inch that the springs are keeping it out. If you put the nuts on the studs and the screws and you start forcing it in, there's something that we still need to do here before that. The teeth of the rings that hold the brake need to align with the sprocket that's in there. Once this is hanging up here on the studs, before you tighten them, you can align them using a screwdriver or whatever. It's very easy. I aligned them using a screwdriver. Let me zoom this in a little bit. I aligned the teeth using a screwdriver, but when I start to put in these nuts and bolts, I am gonna keep an eye on them to make sure that they are going in and sliding in perfectly, that they're not getting stuck on the teeth of the sprocket as I'm putting it in. I put on the 2 nuts on the 2 studs. I haven't put on the other screws yet. They're just in the hole. They're just in the hole there, but they're not really in yet. When you start to snug these up, the two studs, the rings inside will become tight almost immediately. Just bring them to a point where they barely are touching the rings, and then align the rings really well before tightening the studs. Once you tighten the studs, you will not be able to move the rings. Now that I have the studs snugged up and pretty tight and the teeth aligned on that, I am starting to put on the other screws and bring them all in at the same time. You don't want to drive in one side too much and the other not. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on this side and bringing in the screws accordingly to try to bring the cap all even at the same time with all the screws, tightening them up in order at the same time. And once again, as you are putting them in, you have to keep checking and double checking the alignment of the teeth of the plates with the sprocket. Even though I thought I aligned it exactly, they're not. The teeth on this thing need to be perfectly aligned. And once you start tightening all of these, it becomes super tight. You cannot turn them anymore. So, but you do need to keep an eye on them as you're putting it in, because if you catch the teeth on the edge of that sprocket and you keep tightening it, you're gonna bend the teeth. So it turns out here I started to tightening it in all in sequence, and I kept an eye on the teeth, and I'm gonna have to loosen it again to move the teeth again to align them better. They are a bit off. And here's another idea. I have this to about a 1/4 inch, less than a 1/4 inch of closing up. And 2 of the 3 rings with teeth are into the sprocket. Only the last one ended up not being well aligned. If I loosen this up to the point where I could line them up, I may have to loosen it to the point where the second ring comes out, and getting all 3 aligned at the same time is kind of hard. So once you have it evenly in there and you're at the last ring, if the last ring doesn't align, you could actually use the brake release screws, these 2, to loosen the tension on the brake to be able to adjust that last ring without having to back your cover out, so that you don't misalign the other ones and then continue to struggle with it. So here we go. I'm very mechanically inclined. I've done a lot of this. I worked as a mechanic when I was a youngin'. I have never done this before. It's the first time, so if I'm figuring it out as I go along, it's because I haven't done this in particular. But I'm very good at figuring it out, and I hope this information helps you. The 2 screws here that are the brake release, when you put them in, do them both evenly also to push the disc in. First, make sure that you have about the same gap on this side and on the other side of this circle cap thing, and that these are all set at about the same tightness. And then when you release the brake by holding the nut and turning this, do them both at about the same rate, so that you're pushing those, and then you can feel inside to see if you can move the disc with teeth, so you can align it. These are gonna feel tight because they're pushing against all those springs that are very powerful. They seem to be in about the same distance, and the cap seems to be in about the same distance. So at some point, the screw is gonna feel like it's getting tight, but that's because it's pushing on the springs. Just make sure you have that nut enough loose so you're not working against the nut. And then I check if the teeth are loose yet to align it, and it is not. So here we go. I look at the screws to see how far they're in. We want them kind of eyeball them to look like they're in about the same amount. You don't want this one out 1 inch and this one out 1/2 inch. So they look pretty good. And I did a little bit more tightening. I'm gonna check if that ring moves yet. And it does. All right, perfect. It aligned, and I was able to just put it in. There is the teeth are in the sprocket now. Let's see. Lights, camera, action. I can't see what I'm filming because I have the camera on the screen side. But the teeth are in the sprocket. Now, if I release the brake release things, it might push that ring back out of the sprocket. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tighten these a bit. Trying to keep about the same amount of torque on all of them. There, 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 there. This hose makes that one a bit difficult. On that one, I'm gonna use the wrench. And I'm gonna look at the cap, see if it looks even on both sides, top and bottom. It looks a little bit more closed on the bottom than the top. So I checked here, 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 and here, and it looks like the top is more open, and we want it to be even. So I'm gonna do a little bit more on the top ones. Yep, it still needs more on the top ones. All right, now it looks even top and bottom. These are probably pretty loose by now. At some point, you're gonna wanna start releasing these also. Right now we have what, about an eighth, more than an eighth of an inch, not quite 3/16 in this gap. And I'm gonna start to loosen these evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm gonna do one on each of these. When I do more on some of them, it's because they feel totally loose. I'm gonna look at the gap, looking good, even on all sides. Oh no, there's a zip tie stuck in there. God damn it. There was this zip tie stuck in there. It might be all the way into the O-ring and into the cap itself. I pulled on it and it broke. I'm gonna have to take this whole thing back off. All that fun. God damn it. Yep, I'm gonna take it back off. I don't want to take the chance on leaving that piece of a zip tie in there. I had to take it back off because that zip tie was stuck on one end of it. And I pulled on it and a piece of it was inside. So I had to take it all the way back off. But it should be easy to put it back on. It's actually pretty easy. One more pointer. When you take these apart, if the stud comes out, which this one did in my case, don't leave it like that and then put it back on without putting the stud in first. Take the nut all the way off, put in the stud. You have the two studs, and then you put in the nut. Because now when I tighten this, I don't know if the stud on the inside actually screwed all the way into where it's supposed to be. So don't make that mistake like I did. And another tip, when you put this back on, make sure your sensor is not hanging on the inside and you end up cutting your wires with the cap of this, like I did with that zip tie. But yeah, so just make sure your sensor doesn't stay stuck on the inside when you put that together. And once again, another tip. If you are gonna use the brake release screws to release the tension on the teeth, to release the tension so that you can adjust the last tooth ring, it has to be before that last tooth ring is forced against the sprocket. Because these screws, the brake release screws, release the tension in that direction. And from the back, it releases the tension on the back of those discs. If your ring is already forced against the sprocket, using these will not help. Then you have to release this again if it's already forced against the sprocket. So it has to be just slightly off the sprocket in order to be able to use the brake release screws to release it and move it into place. For entertainment purposes only. Continue to record, though I don't know if there's going to be anything useful in this section, but all right. So I got the teeth in. I'm checking that this is all closing evenly on all sides. Looks like it could use a tiny bit more on this side. Very little. The teeth are all aligned. We need to constantly check that. That's going to be our important point here. Also, when you are maybe trying to force the disc into place using a screwdriver or whatever, don't leverage on the seal, on the yoke seal that's here. You could leverage on the center. On the center spindle, you can stick the screwdriver in here to kind of move but if you can't move them softly, don't force it. You need to release the tension on it somehow or another. This is just a little leverage to move them around if they're soft. If they're hard, you're not going to be able to do it. But don't leverage on the seal. Leverage on the center yoke shaft or whatever the hell that's called. But it's looking really good. I did use the brake release screws to loosen the tension from the ring to be able to put it into place. So now that they're all into place, I brought this in a little bit more so that when I loosen the brake, it doesn't push it back out. And I'm gonna loosen the brake while keeping an eye on the rings that it doesn't push them back out and disalign, which I think they will not. I'm gonna loosen the brake release screws. That one is totally released, and that one is totally released. Then I'm gonna bring them all the way out. to there. And then I'm gonna bring all of these in, trying to keep it even by looking around it and see how it's looking. Tighten them all in some kind of order here. I'm gonna look at it. Looks like it's a little bit more close from that side than this side. So I'm gonna go first over here. When I do a lot of them on one, it's because it feels like it's really loose. Wow, looking good, looking even. Now it wants more on this side. And it's practically there. This was actually fun. I enjoyed doing this. It was very, what was it? It was like building a puzzle. It was challenging, but it was good. I like the way it's built. It's sort of a simple system, you might say. And we're there. That's as far as that's gonna go. What, torque wrench you say? What's a torque wrench? That feels about good to me. That feels good. That feels good. Let's see. 45 pounds of pressure. There, that's 45 pounds. Of torque. I might go over them once more, but I want to tell you something about the nut that holds the yoke in place. If you decide to go ahead and grind, well, this is an 1 3/4 socket, and it was tight on there, so it's probably a metric. I slammed it in with the sledgehammer, and it went in fairly easy. If you decide to go ahead and grind it down, you can test which side is already good enough when you're grinding and which side is not by putting it upright like this. And as you see, on this side it already goes in. So that one I do not need to grind down any further. This one I do, and this one I do. So I'm gonna mark the side that's already done. I'm gonna mark it with the Sharpie marker, and then I'm gonna continue to grind the other ones. Those two sides are done. One very important thing to note is if you use the brake release screws to help you do this job, to release the tension on the rings, it's very important that you back out the screws again to their original position and you tighten that nut that keeps them in place. If you forget to do this and you leave those screws in, you will not have brakes when you put this back together and turn on the machine. Very important. In this or any other case, when you use those screws to tow the machine or whatever, it's It's very important to keep that in mind, that you do not have brakes when those screws are in. Also, I was gonna record an image of a list of things to help you do this job. It will be very helpful. I already did the list, and I was gonna record it and put it on the screen so you could take a screenshot of it. But my son told me that I can put a link to it in the description, and it's much better printable format than taking a screenshot. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna put it on the description. I wish you the best of luck. Have fun, enjoy it. I sure did. It's an easy job. There isn't anything really difficult about it, and doesn't really require any special tools. Have fun. Bye.